I want to start this video off by saying that I love Dragon's Dogma 2. It's one of the best games I've played in 2024, and probably one of the most unique games I've played in years. In fact, I made an entire video gushing about my love for this game and what sets it apart from other games in its genre. That video is linked below if you want to hear those thoughts. For my first 30 hours with Dragon's Dogma 2, I was completely immersed. I was loving the game's world and giddy with excitement over the endless possibilities that awaited me as I explored it. However, as I finished up the main story quests in the world's second region and realized that I was barreling towards the game's final confrontation, for the first time in my Dragon's Dogma 2 experience, I started to feel just the tiniest bit of disappointment creep in. It took me a while to pinpoint the exact reason for the disappointment, but a couple hours later, after I had rolled credits and began my adventure in New and New Game Plus, the realization hit me. The world of Dragon's Dogma 2 actually feels kinda small. I know some people are going to take issue with this, and trust me, if I had heard this sentiment during my first 30 hours with the game, I probably would have too. That's bullshit, past me would have exclaimed. You clearly just haven't done enough exploring. But present me, armed with more time with the game, finds the world of Dragon's Dogma 2 just a little bit underwhelming. And while it doesn't change the fact that this is still a fantastic video game, I do think it hampers the experience just a little bit. Let me explain why. Let's start off with the most obvious illustration of this point, the physical map itself. When you first begin your Dragon's Dogma 2 adventure and pull up the map, all unexplored areas are grayed out, which makes the size of the world seem immense. There's a lot of real estate on that map at first glance. However, as you start exploring and uncovering it, you begin to realize just how little of the map is actually explorable, playable territory. Dragon's Dogma 2 does not allow the player to swim. Any contact with the water results in some sort of tentacle monster attacking the player and then returning them to the shore. This already shrinks the playable area a considerable amount, considering there's a lot of water in this game. I mean, look at this map. Half of the world is this huge sweeping body of water that the player can't interact with in any way. Not necessarily the end of the world, but it does make the initial view of the map a little misleading, as I originally thought there would be much more to explore than there actually is. Not being able to do any sort of water exploration was a bummer at first, but I was willing to look past it since initially it seemed there was so much land to explore. But the more I played, the more I found this aspect to be a bit underwhelming as well. Exploration is mostly confined to the roads you see on the map. You can usually wander off them a bit, but straying too far will always eventually have you bumping up against a mountain you can't climb, or being faced again with that pesky water that can't be traversed. I found this to be hugely disappointing. Maybe I've been spoiled by other recent open world games such as Tears of the Kingdom that allow you to pick any spot on the map and eventually get there, but this aspect of Dragon's Dogma 2 really killed some of the sense of wonder I expect from this sort of game. Pulling up the map and being able to see at a glance which parts of the world I could access and which parts I couldn't just by looking at the roads made the world start to feel much smaller to me. So much of the wonder and immersion of these games comes from the feeling of going off the beaten path and finding things that nobody else has seen. Being largely confined to the established roads here is a big blow to that feeling of exploration, and instead makes the adventure feel much more narrow and linear. And speaking of linearity, the shape of the map adds to this feeling as well. The world of Dragon's Dogma 2 is essentially a giant C shape. You start at the top of the C, and the main story path takes you along the letter and ends at the bottom of the sea, with the middle of the letter being that huge, inaccessible ocean. This might sound like a nitpick, and to be fair, it is less of an issue than the other things I mentioned, but for me, it just added to the feeling that I was going along a linear, established path over the course of my adventure, rather than getting lost in a giant open world that was mine to explore. But okay, enough about the map layout, let's talk more about the world itself. Something that, if done well, could easily compensate for a lackluster map. Unfortunately, I feel like Dragon's Dogma 2 stumbles here as well. After spending a substantial amount of time with the game, it became hard for me to shake the fact that everything was starting to feel a bit samey. There is very little geographical diversity in Dragon's Dogma 2's world. The game is broken up into 3 main regions. The first one, the Kingdom of Vermund, is your standard grassy fantasy land. The second region, the Kingdom of Batal, is a fairly by-the-numbers desert area, and the third, the volcanic island, is again the same grassy fantasy land as the first region, just much smaller. Again, maybe I've been a bit spoiled by other recent open world games, but I can't help but think of the awe and amazement I felt when finding the Halig Tree or the Eternal City during my time with Elden Ring, and how those two locales were like nothing I had seen to that point. There's nothing in this game that comes close to that feeling, just a lot of time spent exploring the same two biomes. There are of course caves and caverns and other mini dungeons to explore, but even these start to blend together after a while, with none of them standing out to me as particularly memorable or unique. I did find it cool when exploring a cave would pop you out at another end of the map, thus creating a shortcut for future uses, but the caves themselves all have very similar aesthetics with very similar monsters and creatures inside of them. And one more point on this subject, I found the towns and cities in the game to be disappointing as well. The two major settlements where you'll spend most of your time are Vernworth and Bakbatal. These are by far the largest settlements in the game, and despite these areas being riddled with performance issues, I still found them to be mostly immersive and compelling locales. There are tons of citizens in them going about their business, and lots of side missions to discover and activities to partake in both locations. Outside of those two areas though, the settlements in Dragon's Dogma 2 leave a lot to be desired. There are a few other small towns and villages, but much like the game's biomes and caves and caverns, they all share a similar aesthetic and tend to blend together after a while. Outside of the hidden Elven village, which to be fair is a pretty cool exception. In addition to the bland aesthetic, most of these villages are small and uninspiring, with not much to do and few sights to take in other than a handful of houses. Maybe this is another example of comparing apples to oranges, but once again, it's hard for me to spend time in these bland settlements and not long for the diversity of the towns found in Dragon's Dogma 2's contemporaries. For example, The Witcher 3 is filled with different towns and cities of various sizes, and each and every one of them feels like a unique, lived-in place. Or take a game like Tears of the Kingdom, which doesn't have nearly as many settlements as The Witcher 3, but they all feel vastly different from one another, each one oozing with personality and feeling like it has its own distinct culture. Dragon's Dogma 2's towns and cities fall well short of the ones in those games, and ultimately, they're another missed opportunity in making its world feel as big and as deep as it could. Alright, that's enough negativity for now. I just want to say one more time that I still really like Dragon's Dogma 2. I just feel like the shortcomings of its map and its world hold it back from being something even greater. This is partly why I'm so excited about the prospect of DLC. I didn't play the first Dragon's Dogma game, but my understanding is it received a meaty DLC expansion shortly after its launch, so I'm hoping for the same here. An additional area to explore with maybe a new biome and some more memorable settlements would go a long way in addressing my biggest complaints about this game. Dragon's Dogma 2 is still a special game, one of my favorites of 2024 easily, but the shortcomings of its map and its world hold it back from being one of my favorite fantasy RPGs of all time. That being said, there's no denying that Dragon's Dogma 2 still lays some phenomenal groundwork for the series going forward, and if the fervor and attention that the game generated online is any indication, there's no doubt that at some point down the road, we will be getting a Dragon's Dogma 3. You can bet that I will be there day one when that happens, and if the game can improve upon the shortcomings I talked about today, then I think there's potential for Dragon's Dogma 3 to truly be an all-time great.